Okay, what I'm going to do today is talk about this presentation that I have on editing photo projects. This presentation is something that I show or talk about or present when I get invited to talk at events, and also during my workshops, my editing workshops, and my mentorship program which I conduct over a few months. Hopefully this sort of guide serves as a good sort of introduction so that you can at least sort of get an idea of how you can begin to look at your work, examine it, and start piecing them together in some sort of logical sequence. Now, before we actually begin, it's important to note that for any projects to be worthwhile working on in terms of editing and examining, you do need a lot of images, or at least enough. The more images you accumulate over the duration of your project, the more options you'll give yourself to explore different narratives, outcomes, possibilities of how the visual structure can be communicated. And I think a lot of times the first mistake one does is actually not to have enough images, that we haven't worked hard enough or spent enough time, or that we edit the work too soon perhaps. And it's something that the photographer Daido Moriyama from Japan notes as well. I mean, in order to actually be good, for the work to be good, or for you, the photographer, to be good, you need to spend a lot of time, make a lot of images, thousands and thousands of images. That's the only way you can be any good. So numbers, it's a numbers game. So let's begin. So this little guide, I've called it a sticky introduction to editing. Sticky meaning I'm using sticky notes as a simple sort of visual tool to explain a very basic sort of concept. I'm going to start first with the first slide. So assuming you have spent months, a year, 2 years, 3 years working on a particular project, one that interests you, one that you feel you have to do or that you must do. You've got all this stack of images in front. How do you start? Where do you begin to actually start culling them and getting to that final set of, whether it's 20, 30, 40, 50 or 100 images that you will use as an edit that best represents what you've done or where you spent your time during the course of the project. Okay, let's start by picking one image. Let's call this the surprise image, the most surprising image in your whole set of images. Now you can interpret surprise in many ways. You might pick a surprise image that is visually strong and engaging, or perhaps it's unexpected. But the main thing about it is that this surprise image arouses my curiosity, the audience's curiosity, enough to want to see more about the series. So, you can interpret surprise in many different ways. It might be You might have a story of, you might be working on a project on, say for example, in Singapore, urban development. You could very well pick a picture that shows untouched land in Singapore, for example, maybe an image similar to Chua Chai text, for example, which doesn't show urban development. So in a way, that's kind of surprising. That's one interpretation of surprising. So assuming you've picked your first surprise image, let's go through the bunch of images again and pick a second image. We call this the establishing image. The establishing picture or image reveals where this series of photographs takes place, and this image kind of sets the premise for the series. The image could show a place, a people, or a person. You can decide, like you did with the surprise image, how you wish to interpret establish. But if you refer to if you look at cinema or films, for example, typically a scene in a film, when it opens with an establishing image. For example, a scene of a husband and wife having a conversation at home, for example, an argument. Usually, typically, the edit or the sequence of events in that scene will probably open with a wide shot, perhaps of a housing estate in a particular area or neighborhood. It establishes that this scene is taking place in this establishment, in this neighborhood. Let's pick a third picture. We'll call it a developing picture. So you go through your pile of images again and you pick one significant photograph that develops the story or reveals what the series is about to you. You can be discriminate and tight in your selection, because bear in mind, we're trying to cull images, so every image that you pick has to mean something or has to fight for its place in your edit. You pick one picture that shows something new without being repetitive. So this third picture develops from your establishing shot, which follows the surprise image. So that's the third picture to pick. So if I refer back to my analogy of the husband and wife in having an argument, so maybe in this case I would pick a tight shot of the two subjects, the husband and wife, inside the living room. It's at night and they're having a conversation. So then we have three images. We have surprise, establish, and develop. Now let's move on and pick the fourth image, the climax. So once again, go through your whole pile of images again and pick one significant photograph that depicts the climax of your story, your narrative, your project. Climax, or if you prefer, the high point, the turning point in the story. For example, most stories have conflicts. Most stories are about conflicts, the human condition, and how we as people respond to conflicts. Without conflict, the story or any story isn't that interesting. So basically, in this picture, the climax, the conflict comes to head in this picture. So that's your fourth picture. The sequence at the moment stands surprise, establish, develop, climax. Now you might want to be a bit creative at this point, and you might want to introduce the climax earlier, and perhaps the point of your sequence is to show the aftermath of the climax, of this high turning point of this particular event. So you could probably consider moving the climax after established, so for more dramatic sort of opening. In this case, it would be number 1, surprise; number 2, establish; number 3, we jump straight to a climactic point, and then number 4 is develop. So you're developing a point, a scenario after the climax. Now let's add a fifth final picture to this set of images. Let's call it the concluding picture, conclude. So you have surprise, establish, develop, climax. Now your fifth one is conclude. Once again, go through pile of images and pick one image that you feel concludes the story or the project. Now you can once again interpret conclude in many different ways depending on what the project is about and what you wish to explore or express. You may conclude by revealing a resolution, a result, or perhaps a question, an open-ended question for audiences to part with. So pick that picture, whatever it might be. So essentially what we have now is the 5-picture edit, which consists of 5 pictures, namely number 1, surprise; number 2, establish; number 3, develop; number 4, climax; and finally the 5th, conclude. So this 5-picture edit is tight and it's linear in its narrative, in the sense that it starts, it has a middle, and it ends. So it's borrowed from editorial and photojournalistic practice in terms of telling a story, a very linear story, and it's a good sort of introduction, a way of looking at how we could develop our projects, especially if they're stories that have a very linear structure, a very sort of traditional narrative where there's a start, middle, and end. You can also liken this to an elevator pitch in the sense that it concisely reveals what your series is about in 5 pictures. Now you can build on the 5-picture edit by adding what I call filler images that are equally strong, that are equally sort of descriptive and crucial to your project in terms of narrative, in terms of what you want to communicate. So these images can be placed as and where you feel they work towards serving the series, the sequence. For example, over here I have what an 8-picture edit may look like. The filler images are represented by blue stickies. So here we have we've added one filler after the second establishing shot. We've added one after develop, so it might be a second developing picture because perhaps there's a bit more complexity to the narrative, so we need to develop the story a bit more. So let's insert an additional filler before the climax, and also one after the climax before we conclude. So from the 5-picture edit, we now have an 8-picture edit. This slide shows an 8-picture edit where we've moved the climax to the middle, for example, as a traditional sort of narrative, with start, middle, and end would be. And then also at the bottom of the slide, we've expanded the 8-picture edit to a 10-picture edit. with climax more towards the end. So you can use the same sort of concept by adding 2 more pictures to expand from 5 to 8 to 10. So you place the fillers where you feel the sequence needs them. If you have a very complex story that needs a lot more developing, then obviously you need more fillers after establishing the premise of your story and before you reach the climax. And you might feel that the aftermath of the climactic event should be described a bit more, so you could put 2 more filler sort of images after the climax before you conclude. Now let's go back to the 5-picture edit, and how else can we use the 5-picture edit? Now you can, if you're working on a very large edit, for example for a book, for a photo book publication. Now these 5 pictures, surprise, establish, develop, climax and conclude, you could use them as identifying signifiers or chapter sort of headers for which you can add more images and build a sequence based on chapters. I think if you make a book, which has let's say 90 images, with each chapter titled with working titles like climax, develop and establish, you could start building each chapter and adding more images and building on the narrative using this sort of format. So now let's move on to the next slide. So after you've come up with the 5-picture edit, let's experiment, because essentially what I've presented to you is a guide, somewhat of a rule that some people use, but then really in practice, right, there really are no rules. You can experiment with your edit. The first step was to arrive at those 5 pictures, and then once you get there, you start experimenting, because you know what that looks like. So how does it feel, for example, if we reverse the sequence? So we, right after surprise, we start with the concluding image, which in previous cases was the question. So we could start the sequence by asking a question first and then going backwards. And also for dramatic effect, obviously if you introduce the climax image earlier, it has a lot more sort of dramatic impact on the rest and how we read the sequence, because there isn't you jumping straight to the high point, the turning point in the story. So as suggested, once you've come up with the first 5 picture edit, shuffle things around, move it around, experiment, break the rules. What if we work on a project that isn't necessarily linear in the traditional sense? In terms of storytelling, there isn't really a very visible, obvious traditional structure to the story where there's a start, middle and end. The project could be a typology or a survey or a meditation on a subject, for example, or it might be about mood. I think people often forget that stories that are, or a series of images that ponder the mood, whether it's the mood of a particular time, a particular person, a particular place, that's narrative as well. So the point here, as the slides sort of depict, is you can do that, but The key point to remember is that you don't repeat yourself. You reveal with every new image you show. So the top, for example, the top sequence is basically just repeating the images in a typology that isn't really showing anything new visually or content-wise. So the bottom one example suggests that it's revealing something different. With each image, I'm learning something new as I look at it. Now let's look at the content and context of the images. A simple image of a gift box doesn't say much. It is what it is, you know. Now let's place that image of the gift box next to one of a happy person on the left. Now, when we look at images, there's a natural tendency to associate and bring meaning to what we see, because we're always trying to understand the world, understand what we are seeing. So it's natural for someone to associate or impose our meaning onto things that we see. So in this case, by pairing these two images, what narrative do you get? Now, for example, let's change it. So let's remove the picture of the smiley face and put a sad face next to it. How does it read now? The box, the gift box, the meaning shifts. So what's expressed here is that we can manipulate in some ways context and emotions in the way we edit by placing images next to each other, assigning it some sort of meaning or assumed reading of images. Now there's other ways to edit as well. There's intuitive and visual editing, which some projects will benefit from, or are specifically about design or the way things look photographed. So a graphic element, you can look for graphic elements in the image, be they light, lines or symbols in one photograph that leads to another and another. So that helps you sort of build a sequence. So in this case here, what we have, the first image we have of the sun, my beautifully sketched sun, round in shape, which transitions to the second image, which is the smiley face that we had previously, and it transitions to half crescent moon, which is also circular in form, and then it transitions to the round sad face. So here we're purely looking at the circular form as a thread that ties our sequence together from one to the second to the third to the fourth. So here's an example using Iping Chia's project 05856. This project was a portrait of his family, his kids, and his perspective as a father. So the first picture, Iping's daughter is holding up a pillow, kitty sort of pillow. It's pink. So the pink allows us to transition to the second image, which is a circular pink plate of cut sandwiches that he made for his daughter. So the thread here in this case is the pink, the color pink. Then from the plate of sandwiches, we transition to the orange bucket of laundry, the laundry he does for his kids. So the thread here is the circular shape, and its form within the frame and the scale, so they're very similar, so that allows us to visually thread these two images together. So in a sort of quick nutshell, the pink in the pillow transitions to the pink in the round plate transitions to the round bucket of laundry. Here's two more examples. The first sequence one is from Peter Tay, again one of my mentees, very talented photographer. It's from his project 40 and some things. So the first sequence, as an example, there's 3 images here. So the first image of the arm with the scars at the wrist area transitions in a triangular sort of line towards to the next image, which is shadows, and the shadows kind of mirror the fingers in from the first image in an opposite sort of triangular direction, and then that sort of the fingers and the light sort of transitions to the third final image of the hand in a sink of water. So the reflections from the second image kind of transitions to the reflections in the water in this image, and also the water in many ways, in some ways, suggests a sort of cleansing, clarity, and aside from that as well, the directional position of the arms and the shadows in the second image kind of correspond with each other. So that sort of threads this sequence of 3 images. So second sequence, also from the same series, Peter's 40 and somethings. The first image, the subject is in this bar, and the lights reflected off a disco ball are speckled all over the image. They look like fireflies, butterflies, and we use that as cue to transition to the second image, which is a page in a photo album where the subject has stuck hearts all over the page, and so they kind of these hearts that speckle the page connects with the fireflies from the disco light in the previous image. So however which way you choose to edit, the key important question to ask yourself is what are you editing for? You have to consider what your output is. What medium and how are the audience is going to view the work. Is it a slideshow of 20 images on your website, for example, where one image fades in and then fades out to the next image, so it's the viewers sort of view it in a very sort of linear fashion, so you can predict what they will see now and what they will see later. So if that's what you're doing, then you have to edit your series of images that way. Are you editing for a book, for example? So the experience of viewing image in a book is more tactile. It's in your hands, and you kind of flip, and you can flip from one page to the next, and then you can jump from the start to the beginning to the end. So the experience of viewing an edit on a book is very much different to on screen. And on screen, you might be limited to 20 images. In a book, it could be anywhere from 30, 40 to 90 images. So the edit is perhaps a lot wider. and also the consideration of what when you edit for a book, what size is the book, and depending on the size, how will that sort of affect the size of your images, how will they sit on the page. So these are some things to consider. You could be editing for an exhibition where the images are placed in a three-dimensional space. Can audiences move and flow within a three-dimensional sort of space in a very much different way to how I would flip a book or look at images on a screen. So I may move from one wall to another wall in a fashion that is very different to someone else, or when I go to visit an exhibition, it might affect how I move within the space. If I go to an exhibition during an opening, there's very likely a lot more people, so my movements might be dictated by how much people there are in the room, whether the opening section is clogged up, so I have to skip the opening section and then move to the middle part, for example, or start from the end. So the experience of viewing the work or experiencing the work is very different. So photography and this process of editing is about creating worlds and intensifying the worlds that you create to suspend disbelief. You want the audience to suspend their critical faculties and believe in something unbelievable that you have created. You want them to sacrifice their sense of realism and logic when they encounter the work or when they look at the series. For example, there's a saying with film in cinema as well, that film or cinema is life with all the boring parts removed, right? So that's a very sort of good analogy to think about it as well. When you watch a movie, it feels like you're presented with this world, and then for 1.5 hours you kind of live in that world. So in many ways, when we edit our projects, it's a similar sort of experience that we're going for. So another final point, as the stick is here sort of suggest, with a million ways to edit but one gut feeling. So what that means is that every editor is different, and so will their interpretation of a project be. So if you take a project to a editorial editor, he will look or connect with the work very differently to if you presented your work to a photographer or an editor that had sympathies with conceptual photography. So essentially what that also means is that you might end up with multiple edits of the same work and for different purposes. So I think it's a very important point that if you were to get someone or work with someone in editing and visualizing your projects, that they share similar views, or the person is sympathetic to what you want to do and how you've done it. So once you've done an edit and arrived at some place where you have your final set of images, what's right, what's wrong is a matter of perspective. Sometimes it's about that one gut feel that yes, this is right, this is my final edit. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. Thanks for listening and looking, and happy editing.